Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. My name is Pope Metallica. Sorry for the stupidity there. I'm playing around with openings, so excuse that. And welcome back to Rock and Roll Religion, where we got a pretty interesting one for you today. This band is not one of my favorites, but they're really important and a good band. Just because they're not one of my personal favorites doesn't mean they're not eminently talented in their own way. And far above and away their actual musical impact on the genre, they have much more of a cultural impact due to the reaction to some of their work by the Karens of the 1980s, being the PMRC, these guys being the reason they were created. And of course, we are talking about the band W.A.S.P. And let's see here. There we go. These guys were part of the LA scene in the early 80s. I think they formed in 82 around the core of Blackie Lawless and Randy Piper with, a pair of guitarists for hire, essentially. Or Blackie was also a guitar player, but he moved between guitar and bass depending on who they had in the band. These guys came up in that scene in the early 80s. This is a time in heavy metal, especially in the LA scene, where everyone wanted to play heavy metal and wanted to play the same style of music, essentially, and was having a really tough time getting noticed. So it was really, you had to get either more shocking in terms of your lyrical content, be really out there with your stage show or, costumes and stuff like that, or both. And Wasp opted for option C, do both. And they were kind of one of the more out there bands. And their first release actually had to have a song edited off the front of the album to be released in the United States. It would be re-released on their 1998 CD re-release. But that song and this album got pulled off store shelves and was the reason behind the for those of you who are old enough to remember or have heard me talk for 5 minutes at length without going into this, the Parents Musical Resource Center, otherwise known as my favorite punching bag, the PMRC, and Tipper Gore in particular. This was the album she was mad at. W.A.S.P. self-titled release right here. This was the beginning of that whole nonsense. And honestly, pretty good album. I wouldn't say it was worth the massive, well, on our side, it wasn't worth a massive hullabaloo because it was a good album, don't get me wrong, but it wasn't like one of the greatest things anyone's ever seen. But on the other side, yeah, these people lost their fucking minds about it. And if you read into some of the lyricism and some of the content that W.A.S.P. has, I can see why. I don't agree with them trying to ban it. And you're right, Soul Assassin. I mean, Streisand effect, guys. Like, the more you try to shut something down, the more popular it becomes. They tried it with rock and roll in the 50s, as those of you who were there on Thursday night for my excellent discussion with a whole bunch of guests, including 70s Rock Fan, Joe's Atmosphere, Courtney Fellowship Vodballs, Scott from Sporting News Podcast, like all of some of the really cool YouTubers I deal with on a fairly regular basis, and just generally great people. And that was one of the central focuses of that, was the critical reaction in the 50s to rock and roll, and that was way tamer than what this was. I mean, the tagline for the song that was banned, the song's actual title is The Animal, with the subtitle I Fuck Like a Beast. So, you can imagine what the lyrical content looked like. And that would be a staple of W.A.S.P. going forward, and especially for their live show. These guys really focused. I mean, musically, they're not bad, but they're fairly standard for the time. And I don't want to say that in an insulting way, but they were just kind of there musically. Although I will say Chris Holmes is an excellent guitarist, and Blackie Lawless, in addition to being an excellent singer, has a good songwriting ability. And absolutely has the right attitude for heavy metal of basically fuck you, we do what we want. And if you don't like it, we're going to crank it up to 11 and do it even more. So that was the kind of the situation there. As for the rest of the album, not only is the Animal a classic, the first three tracks on this record being the Animal, I Want to Be Somebody, and Love Machine are all should be in this band's greatest hits. And so would the last track on this record, Show No Mercy. It's like these guys get hard and fast, they're excellent, but they tend towards this mid 80s tendency to kind of slow down in the middle of the record and do a little bit more ballady or a little bit more low tempo stuff. And I think on this album it struggles a little bit for it. Although I will say on the next record that we're going to talk about, the second one, that they kind of figured out how to do that well by that point. And before we get too far into it, we got Lord Thoth, Christian Delorme, Soul Assassin, Fischozo. Good to see you guys as always. And good to be talking about this stuff in between doing research for the next history of rock and roll stream, which is going to be an absolute nightmare. If you thought the 50s were interesting, we're about to branch off into a whole new level of fuckery because we have rock and roll popping up all over the planet. And it's all a reaction to this one artist who was in America at the time or British. It is a whole mess of shit. It's a lot of fun stuff though, and a lot of really excellent music. And for Axelon, how's it going? Oh man, it's like this band, I think again, would have been kind of an average middle of the road 80s heavy metal band if it hadn't been for the attention that Tipper Gore and her coven of wenches gave them with the PMRC, and then started trying to crack down on metal as a whole because of them. And they were a standard to above average metal band, and this propelled them into the top tier of these guys. Would have kind of been in the middle of the pack, like not really gotten much attention, like your standard new band. They would have done probably pretty well on their first release, but nowhere near what this ended up being, which is essentially a classic release, more due to the Tipper Gore was the woman who hated metal. She walked in on her son playing this record, so the story goes, and immediately started a crusade against not only heavy metal but also hard rock and all sorts of quote unquote vulgar music. This album cover that you're looking at right here is the reason we have a parental advisory sticker on music to this day. That this is when that started. Before that, there was no such thing as parental guidance or whatever. Oh yeah, Soul Assassin, their live show. This is more later in their career, and we'll get to that in a different show when we get into their later work, like KFD and some of their later stuff. But their live shows have always been pretty out there. Very elaborate for a small band, because I've said it on the show before. One of the reasons that once the popularity of metal died down in the late 80s, early 90s, a lot of the stage presence and a lot of the really elaborate sets and stage shows and a lot of the pyro and all that kind of stuff went away, was because the live show is where bands make their money. So all of the sets and stuff like that is coming out of their cut. So if people aren't showing up to see it, then they can't put on that good of a show if they want to make any money. And that's the only place bands make money. The record labels basically screw them on every record they make. It's insane how the industry works, but it's the only way it works, unfortunately. until the modern era where you can kind of self-publish and stuff like that. So you might be much lesser known, but you're you're actually working for yourself rather than a larger label. And some bands have gone that way. I know Ambush has kind of done that, and a whole bunch of guys from the NWOTHM scene are just kind of self-publishing. But there's advantages to both sides because then you don't have the marketing department of a major label behind you trying to push your music out to everybody. So, and yes, Rob Paulson was the anti-video game idiot that had been proven wrong like 14 times, and every now and again that argument still comes up, and I want to smack whoever makes it. It's just like, no, you absolute morons. We've done the research, we've done the studies. Heavy metal and violent video games tend to make people happier. Like, I'm not saying that, the research is saying that. But again, this is one of those we ignore the science when it tells us something that doesn't support our claim argument. But yeah, this first record, I would recommend at least give it a listen on YouTube. I don't know if it's up everyone's alley. I would see if they're your cup of tea before I buy a lot of this stuff. I enjoy them. I enjoy them quite a bit. But then again, I also enjoy a lot of stuff that you guys probably don't. So for those of you who do follow my recommendations and disagree, well, I apologize, but you pay your money and you take your chances. The following tour, they actually toured with some pretty big people like Dokken, Metallica, Armored Saint, like a lot of pretty big names in the 80s metal scene. And then the next year they came out with another record being The Last Command. This one had a really interesting sound to it. Really more bluesy than I was expecting. Because I had listened to Wild Child and a couple of the real classics from this record, but until I'd done the research for this, I hadn't listened to the whole record in its entirety. And is it all killer, no filler? No. There are a couple songs that I wouldn't say fit outside of this record. As part of this record, I think they're great. I think they're good, but I don't think that they're good songs on their own, if that makes sense. By the way, happy birthday to your son, man. That's always cool. 8th birthday. Wow. So, well, yeah, that happens too. But there are some true excellent tracks on this record. We'll get into the track listing here because I have it pulled up. There we go. The first two on this track or on this record are absolutely awesome. Wild Child is a timeless classic. It's the one everyone knows from this band, and that's for a reason. It's not the heaviest song they've ever done. It's not the fastest. It's not the most offensive. I think you'll have to look to a later album for that I'll probably cover by itself, because that is a concept album that goes into some really interesting shit. Being the Headless Children. And we will absolutely get into that record because I think it's their finest hour in terms of their actual meaningful impact. But this album right here, a lot of the early stuff is pretty much meaningless fun, but it is really fun. Like, Wild Child's fun. Ball Crusher is fucking hilarious. If you read the lyrics, it is absolutely hysterical, and I can't repeat a single one of them or I'd get banned on YouTube. Like, this is that kind of band. Just absolutely a fun romp. Blind in Texas is a great, almost blues rock tune that's a lot heavier, which fits the early heavy metal style, where it was a lot bluesier than, say, later stuff like, say, Judas Priest or later Judas Priest or Iron Maiden is. It was much more similar to like an early Black Sabbath. And you can hear a little bit of like Stevie Ray Vaughan in there, which is interesting. They've got kind of this blues swagger to it that I really dig. The Last Command, really an excellent song. Almost leaning towards like the power, like kind of the cheesy power ballad side of 80s metal, but doesn't never really quite runs into it. Um, really quite unusual for this band because, like I said, they tend to be the hard, fast, and in your face type than doing this, and you would not really expect a song like this to come from Wasp, but they do. And Blackie Lawless is an excellent songwriter throughout his career. In fact, these guys are still performing to this day, and I would recommend you look up some of their later stuff off of albums like Golgotha and shit like that. We'll cover that later because otherwise I would be here for an hour talking about their albums by myself, um, with no interruption. And they're still making excellent content to this day, which I think is a mark of quality that a lot of the 80s bands or 80s quote unquote hair bands didn't have, was that staying power that they had one idea and one gimmick. And once that was gone, they were done. Whereas Wasp kind of took it on the chin. They did kind of take a pause in the 90s to reorient, reevaluate. And then in the early 2000s went into the reattack with some of their later material. And ever since, they've been killing it. And even throughout the 90s, they were releasing excellent albums. These guys don't have a one that I would consider truly bad. Like, there's albums I like more than others. I think their next one, than this, The Electric Circus, is subpar for them. Like, I don't think that's their best work by far. This is up there with some of their best. And they're one of those bands that has never set the trend, but they do a really solid job of being with the best in what they do. And I think they deserve respect for that. And honestly, the fact that they forced the issue when it came to censorship and stuff like that in this industry and won in the long run. They struck down the PMRC and a whole bunch of other shit in the 1990s after about 5 or 6 years worth of hemming and hawing and just fighting with politicians and goddamn mothers of America. You'll hear me bitch about that on the veterans channels too. To the moon, Alice. To the moon. For those of you who get that reference, you're old enough to be here. Devil made me do it. How's it going, dude? For those of you who don't recognize him, Devil's on the Saturday night Skin and Max Saturday on That's Talking's channel, which I'm a regular guest on, which I absolutely love. And I would say Pantera is leaning into them because right about the time Pantera started was right about the time these guys were really starting to hit their stride, about 86, 87. So these are, they're part of this scene and and they are influential later on down the line. They weren't just, an also ran. These guys are a big part of the scene. It's just they're not one of the more recognized ones, and a lot of the more, shall we say, purist elements don't really respect this side of the genre as much as somebody like I do. Where I respect a lot of these guys who this is the sound they wanted to make, and they didn't do this because they were expecting it to get paid doing it. They did this because they were fucking adamant about doing this kind of music, and really, and this is the kind of music they wanted to make. And shock rock was kind of like that as a genre, where they were intentionally doing it to get a rise out of people, because even back then they knew the Streisand effect exists. The more you get offended by something, the more people are going to put eyes on it to see what they should be mad about. And then they're like, oh, this is actually pretty good. So from a marketing standpoint, it's actually really fucking smart. And like I said, by the time these guys had come on the scene in 82, the world had a million heavy metal bands that were trying to make it. So you had to either musically be the best thing that had ever fucking happened, like Alcatraz. That was one of the reasons they were popular, is they had one of the best guitar players anyone had ever seen in Yngwie Malmsteen. Or you had to have a gimmick, be it your lyricism, your outrageous stage performance, your costumes. In this case, W.A.S.P chose all of the above. And yeah, Lord Thoth, sometimes I'll come out with shit you've never expected, just because honestly, the Honeymooners, you've never seen it now, it used to be on reruns when I was a kid. Like they would have it on like Saturday nights on on some channels, and I grew up watching some of it. It was a good show. And then Papa Cotton, always good to see you, man. Always happy to have the support of my fellow clergymen, especially the Cotton ones, because they're nice and plushy. But yeah, man, these guys, are they the most musically expressionistic or outstanding metal band you've ever seen? No. Are they really cool and kind of a window into a different time where people didn't give a fuck about getting canceled, and if somebody tried, you just cranked it even louder, gave them the finger, and then played an even more disgusting riff, or wrote an even worse lyric? Because if you read the Animals lyrics, then read the ones for Ball Crusher on the next album, and you'll see they learned absolutely nothing, went to 11 and said, fuck you, we're going to do it even worse. And you're absolutely right, Papa. Blackie is better than Lucy. Although we can all appreciate Lucy Lawless in her prime. She was a magnificent creature. Her little girlfriend there wasn't too bad either. But no, man, these guys, again, like, I like to talk about, the really influential ones, and it doesn't always include the musically influential ones. Sometimes you're just around for the things you said at the right time. Why do you think Twisted Sister is a thing? And I do enjoy some of their music. I will never feature Twisted Sister on this channel because Dee Snider's a fucking sellout. And I'm sure those of you who've been watching for more than, a couple episodes will have no surprise at me saying that, because I say it almost all the time because it bears repeating. Dee Snider's a fucking cunt. If you guys don't know, he was one of those ones who basically turned his back on his own principles and was like, "Oh yeah, just get the jab, it'll be fine." And Vor, you are hardly alone to that on that one, man. We've all been there. Even half of the women who watch this show have probably done it at least once. He'll raise her fist. Exactly. That dude, Razor put him in his fucking place, and it was great to watch. For those of you who are on Twitter and want to be entertained just by someone taking a huge steaming dump on someone's life from the top rope, go follow Razor Fist. Even if you don't watch his content on YouTube, although you fucking should become part of the Razor Force. He's a great dude. He's usually right, which is insane about some of the things that he said that we thought he was nuts for at the time, and yet he turned out to be correct. Like, I believe one of his better ones was, "You will beg for George Lucas before the end." We thought he was nuts at the time. Welp. Yeah. But no, like these guys were like the exact anti woke movement way before it even really existed. Back in the 80s, it was called political correctness, and these guys were like, "Oh yeah, fuck off, I don't care. If you're mad about it, you can be mad about it, but be mad about it somewhere else." And that's always been the mental attitude of, "That's nice, go the fuck away, I don't care. If you don't like it, someone else does. And if this record label doesn't like it, I don't care. We'll keep doing it until they shut us down." And some bands did go down like that. Grim Reaper did. A couple of other bands that I'm aware of. And other ones, Motorhead is a big, big example of this. The fans loved them. The venues loved them. The critics even liked them quite a bit. The record labels fucking hated these guys because they absolutely would not do what they were told. They made the exact album they were gonna make every time, always. I'm not even sure Lemmy was awake during those pitch meetings because he basically just threw whatever they wanted out and then did what they were going to do anyway. And W.A.S.P did something um, similar where they just kind of went, that's nice, fuck off, not going to pay attention, and then went even harder on their next record and continued going even harder for quite a while until the Headless Children really was their big one with Chainsaw Charlie, which yeah, read the lyrics on that shit. Holy crap. And no, I'll call him a fucking sellout because he was already successful when um he started this shit. And half of the reason he was successful were because people supported him when his head was on the chopping block and he wanted to go against authority. But the second he agrees with what the government's doing, oh, well, then we need to sit down and shut the fuck up and do what we're told. That's what makes him a sellout, not the fact that he's successful. And that has been your weekly sermon at Pope's altar of being an anti-corporate douche. But no, that is really the story of the early W.A.S.P. If you want me to get into the PRC history and what that consisted of and all that, that's a whole topic in and of itself. And if you guys really want that, I will cover it in a video at some point. But again, that's going to be like the history of rock and roll, where I need to do research and look up records and actually do deep dives into some archives and figure out exactly who said what, when, and what the result of it was. I do want to do that though, because there's some interesting non-musical stuff that happens in this genre too. And that's almost, I don't want to say just as important as the music because it isn't, but it does set the stage for a lot of this music and the attitudes around it. Because like I was saying on Thursday night, this kind of music, be it, or any kind of music really, doesn't happen in a vacuum. You always have social, cultural, political, economic influences that are all competing and affecting the people who are writing this music. And what they come up with is a direct result of that, for good or bad. In the case in the 50s, it gave us rock and roll. And unfortunately, in the case in the 70s, it gave us disco. So, you win some, you lose some. But overall, these guys are influential more for them kind of paving the way for other more extreme bands to come. Like, you would probably not have seen the second wave of black metal in the United States without bands like this kind of paving the way for it and creating precedents to allow those albums to be imported and brought in. So they're super important on that front. And also musically, they're quite a good band as well. So they're a fun listen. And yeah, Widowmaker's not a bad one. I wouldn't put that in their filler category, but it's it's a pretty good one. I enjoyed it quite a bit. That was one of those ones where I looked up like, okay, yeah. Yeah, that was a pretty solid track. I think my absolute favorite off this record is Ball Crusher, though. That song is fucking hysterical. And the music's fucking great too. So absolutely go check these guys out. It won't be this Thursday, but next Thursday, I'll be trying to do the History of Rock and Roll Part 2, which will be going into the surf rock scene in the West Coast and the British invasion for Thursday, probably again, same time, because I know most of my guests are kind of free that night, and we may play around with the timing a little bit, but that'll be when it happens. In the meantime, absolutely go watch that video if you haven't. If you do, Please leave a like on it if you haven't already. Again, it does help the channel, and we're we are actually growing quite a bit here. I don't know how much of that is due to my activities with Soldier Spirits channel and Vets Talking, and how much of that is just my own growth. But either way, I'm glad to have you guys here. I'm glad people are enjoying the content, and yeah, you're right, Papa. Wild Child is a pretty good song, and I wouldn't put it in their top. I think a lot of stuff they've done, probably a lot later, really shines compared to these first two. But for their first two records, these are excellent releases, and I would recommend that you at least give them a listen. I won't say that these aren't must-own records. These aren't timeless classics for anything for every collector or whatever. But if you're in that kind of genre and you're in that kind of mood, throw up some W.A.S.P. I think you'll be pleasantly surprised. And with that being said, take care, stay safe. I love you all, and I'll catch you next time.